Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We are looking at the inauguration of David and the decision that he made to bring the ark back into Jerusalem. Now, he made it as a team decision. We looked at that the first 30, 60, 90 days, leveraging your team, getting weigh-in for buy-in, exploring without commitment, and how you're talking about certain things that you're doing. But David knew inside of his heart this was the right thing and the best thing for Israel. Going to read just a little bit of the passage that has been our text and then give us the thought today, and that is the biggest payoff. I'm going to say that again. Today we're looking at the biggest payoff. 1 Chronicles 13, 1-4. If it seemed good to you, and if it is of the Lord our God, let us send out to our brethren everywhere who are left in all the land of Israel, and with them to the priests and Levites who are in their cities and their common lands, that they may gather together to us, and let us bring the ark of our God back to us, for we have not inquired at it since the days of Saul. David, when he assessed the condition of Israel, he probably had a massive list of things that he could do as king. He probably had a bunch of civil projects that he could start, rebuilding different things, policies that he wanted to establish. There were probably a lot of problems. We know there was a lot of idolatry. There was a lot of sin issues that David also would go on to address. But here's what David did. He really looked at what is the biggest problem that if I just went ahead and dealt with this, it would actually solve many of the ancillary problems. And it was really this. He goes, hey, we haven't inquired of God's presence since the time of Saul. The reason we have idolatry, the reason we have so many bad policies, the reason we're so lost as a people is because we aren't doing the first thing, and that is putting God first, God at the center of our nation. If I could just fix that, it will fix a lot of other things. Too many times as leaders, we're dealing with the fruit rather than the root. I'm going to say that again. Too many times we're dealing with the fruit rather than the root. We have 50 things on our to-do list, and we look at all of these things we had to get done, and we're doing them, and we do them well, and we do them hard because we're hard workers. But when we really stop and analyze the root causes of many of those, they're symptoms, not problems. They're symptoms of deeper issues. If we would take the time and just go down and deal with the deep-rooted issue, many of these other things are going to go away. And this is exactly what David did. Basically, rather than coming in and doing a bunch of things, 10 things that might give minimal results, he did one thing that had significant results, and that's what we see. David did this in his past when he killed Goliath. Israel had a lot of problems. They had the Philistines camping in the land of Judah, and they were standing on God's promised territory for them. And we see that he goes, I'm going to kill this giant today and remove this reproach from Israel. So when he did that, the rest of the Israelites rallied, and they continued to pursue the Philistines. He knew, I don't need to kill that whole army. I just need to take out one. If I just take out that one, it'll inspire everybody else to take out the rest. On April 14th, 1912, the captain of the Titanic probably had 7, 8, 10 things on his to-do list that day. Things like making sure guests are happy, having to go around and, talk to that person and talk to that person, making sure all the dining sheets were clean, all the linens were put out just right, and making sure the chairs on the deck were straightened. And he probably got all of them done except number one, and that was avoid icebergs. Look, there are many people straightening up chairs on the Titanic, and your ship's going down. Sometimes the most important thing you could do is just don't hit that iceberg that's looming in front of you, because your guests and your customers are going to be a whole lot happier. And too many businesses are focusing on the wrong things. Too many churches are focusing on the wrong things. Too many leaders and managers are focusing on the wrong things. And what are those icebergs that we need to avoid? What is that one or two things that if we really just did this in this next quarter, if we just did this in the next 30 days, that would produce the greatest results? Football teams don't win Super Bowl championships based on how many yards they covered inside of a season. There may be a team who actually covered more yardage, but that's not the team that goes to the Super Bowl. It's the team that made the most touchdowns. And too often we think, well, I was running around on the football field and I was moving that. I wore out that 50-yard line. That's great. What you want to wear out is the end zone. That's what you want to wear out. You don't get rewarded because you're playing. You get rewarded because you're making progress and scoring touchdowns. Focus on the touchdowns inside of your leadership. Now, David knew this. Putting God back at the center of the nation of Israel would deal with so many other issues. Now, as a leader, that really applies to all of us, and that is, has God been left out at the center of your life? Because you're busy doing a bunch of things that you think are actually problems. I mean, I don't have time for God. I don't have time for church. I don't have time for my devotions. Maybe you don't have time because you're doing a bunch of things that are symptoms from not doing the most important thing, which is putting God first. Look, start your week with God. Be faithful and consistent to attend church. Be faithful every day, putting God into your morning time, your devotion time. Bookend your day with God. Start with God and say, God, what do you have for me today? What do you want to do? And then just review with God. God, anything you want to teach me about today? Anything I could be doing better? And just dialogue with God throughout the day. Involve him in your meetings. If you're leading a church, obviously God should be incorporated in prayer. But talk to God as you're going in to do your business presentation, as you're getting ready to go to that sales pitch. Just take a moment and say, God, I'm inviting you into this. God, I'm doing this with you. It's through you and by you that I can do this. Involve God. Keep him at the center of your life each and every day. And what you'll find is many of the things you thought were problems are just going to go away because you dealt with the real issue, which David understood, and that is getting God back at the center of the nation, back at the center of our lives. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.